Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today I am going to review a couple of books that I have recently read. I have about three here, and let's get started. The first one is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. The Bell Jar was originally published in the UK in 1963 under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas. It is the only novel that I'm aware of poet Sylvia Plath. And it wasn't published in the UK under her own name until 1967, and it wasn't published in the US until 1971. And this, I believe, was in accordance with Plath's ex-husband and Plath's mother. They agreed that it would not be published because I think they believed that people would recognize themselves in this book. And this is set in the 1950s. We are following 19-year-old Esther Greenwood as she goes through her summer, first in New York, working for a women's magazine, and then her return home to Massachusetts, where she did suffer a psychological breakdown and subsequent institutionalization. Esther's story does parallel Plath's own story, so we've got a little bit of autofiction here. Plath also spent a summer working at Mademoiselle magazine in New York, and she did also suffer a psychological breakdown and was institutionalized at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. The major themes of this book cover womanhood and women's roles. You know, a 1950s woman was expected to marry and become a housewife. Unfortunately, Esther feels like she is a prisoner to these expectations. She wants to work, she wants to be independent. And the good thing about this is we actually get to see women working in the first part of the book while Esther is in New York. Her boss is an important editor at this magazine. Esther also spends a lot of time thinking about sex and virginity and how there is a double standard for men. She is furious that she is expected to stay a virgin while the guy that she's expected to marry has a past sexual relationship with someone and has absolutely no consequences. Esther is even fitted for a contraceptive device, which would have been absolutely shocking at the time for contemporary readers. It just wasn't the common thing to do. And in 1950s, I think in some states it was probably illegal. I could be wrong about that, but I think it was illegal for a good amount of time for unmarried women to be getting contraceptive devices. This book also covers mental health. Esther describes herself as being suffocated by a bell jar, and a bell jar is a thick glass container sometimes used to create a vacuum space. And most of the novel does deal with Esther's psychological breakdown and her experiences in a psychological hospital. 1950s treatment for mental illness was barbaric, and the popular form of treatment was shock therapy and even lobotomies. So people who had been in institutions were essentially treated as social pariahs. So I've had The Bell Jar on my list to read for many, many years, but I always stayed away from it because I was actually very, very nervous to read it, not necessarily for content. I actually didn't really know what it was about, but I thought it was going to be difficult to read because Plath was a poet. I have a very, very hard time with poetry, and I just was like, oh God, I'm never going to get through this book because she's a poet. She's going to write poetic things, and I'm not going to understand what's going on. Happily, that is not the case with this, and this is written in clear, contemporary vernacular. If I hadn't known that Plath was a poet ahead of time, this book would not have alerted me to the fact. There was nothing poetic, in my opinion, about this book. However, I did find myself being very underwhelmed by this book. Wasn't moved and honestly found myself confused as to all of the fuss that this book created. And I can definitely see this as being subversive for 1960s audience. But I'm really unsure as to why many women still find it profound today. And I'm wondering if that's because I didn't read it when I was younger. I'm at this point in my life, I'm no longer struggling with identity and entry into adulthood. I didn't dislike my time with this book. It was funny and smart, and Esther is a woman who, never succumbs to the societal expectations. She doesn't fall in line, which is probably one reason she was deemed as crazy. But I had expected something moving and amazing and profound. And maybe this is a book that needs another read and ends up being a book to study and appreciate instead of enjoying. I don't know. But I did go in expecting to be, profoundly moved, but I just wasn't. And similar to my reaction when I first read The Catcher in the Rye many years ago, I was confused as to all the fuss. Again, at the time this was written, this would have been absolutely shocking. I can't understand that. But what I can understand is why, The Bell Jar and even Catcher in the Rye would be so profound to current audiences. So it could be something that I'm just missing, or maybe, I'm no longer the target audience for this. At one time I was, and today I'm not. So who knows? I do think I will give it another read at some point, because there is a lot in here. There really is a lot to explore in here. Couple of warnings. This is a book of its time, and Plath does have several racist remarks that would have completely gone unnoticed in the 1960s. It didn't appear to me that it was intentionally hateful, more stereotypical, but it was still jarring, and it actually took me out of the story a couple of times. So that's warning number one. Warning number two, there is a triggering matter with an attempted rape. So if that is something that is triggering for you, do not read this book. Otherwise, like I said, I enjoyed my time with the book. It just didn't move me as much as I had expected. Next, I read Highland Fling by Nancy Mitford. This is Nancy Mitford's very first novel, published in 1931. Nancy Mitford is also the author of The Pursuit of Love, which a couple years ago was made into a, not Netflix, maybe Amazon Prime series. I watched it. It was very adorable. I have not read The Pursuit of Love. This is my first Nancy Mitford. In Highland Fling, Nancy Mitford roasts her aristocratic class. Mitford came from the upper echelons of British society, and she just roasts everybody in here. Nobody is safe. Nobody has a hard life. Nobody has a real job. Castles are lent and borrowed, and the upper classes just eat, drink, and hunt. Nobody is really likable, and nobody is safe from Mitford's satire. So we are following young artist Alfred Gates as he returns from Paris and visits with his newly married friends Walter and Sally. Walter and Sally have no money, despite Sally being an heiress, and they live on, quote, nothing a year because neither have jobs. Sally's aunt and uncle ask her to fill in as a hostess at their castle for a hunting party, and their castle is located in the Scottish Highlands. Walter and Sally agree to this arrangement so that they can actually sublet their flat in order to get some extra cash. Guests include old and stodgy military men, some lords and ladies, and even a young guest named Jane Dacre, who becomes obsessed with Albert, who basically starts offending the older guests by wearing flamboyant clothing and running around the castle photographing Victorian furniture for his book. While the older guests get up at dawn to go hunting, the younger folks stay in bed until afternoon and drink champagne for breakfast. Some pranks are pulled, the castle may or may not have a ghost, and then an unexpected event sends them all home early. At the heart of this book is old generation versus new generation. The old generation are Victorians and Edwardians who look down upon the new generation, or as they were called at the time, bright young things, as being lazy and thoughtless and disrespectful. The new generation looks down upon the Victorians as being racist, old-fashioned, and rigid. Does that sound familiar to you today? A little bit of boomer versus Gen Z we got going on here. All in good fun. There is a moment of seriousness, though. In chapter 11, I felt was a pivotal chapter in the sense of this generational argument, specifically in terms of the First World War. So this was published in 1931. World War II hasn't happened yet, so Mitford hasn't experienced this yet. So this, old generation versus new generation really occurred via the First World War. So the Victorians and the Edwardians had fought in the war, while the bright young things would have been too young. They would have been children at the time. And the Victorians say, well, you have no idea what we went through, what we suffered. And the bright young things say, well, the war had nothing to do with us, and the war is all your fault, and we are not going to fight in any new wars because you created all this. This is all your fault. So really important discussion here in a moment of seriousness as to how this disparity and this looking down upon each other occurred due to a war. This book is essentially no plot, all vibes, and the vibes are light and funny. I read this in one sitting. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. Mitford is like Jane Austen in the sense that she is an observer of people and manners. She is funny, she is savage, and I just couldn't help noticing the comparison between Austen and Mitford. I just really enjoyed it. My one gripe with this book is that it was a touch too long, and I feel it could have ended way earlier than it did. I almost feel like it should have ended once the hunting party broke up. But it didn't. It went on for a few more chapters and it just did start to get tedious. So that's my only gripe with it, but I did enjoy it and I can't wait to read more of Mitford's writing. Last, I read I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, translated from the French by Roz Schwartz. Now, this has been the BookTube darling of 2024. It's been on the favorites lists of so many booktubers in 2024, and I can see why. So this was originally published in 1995. I'm not exactly sure when it was first translated into English, but I think the reason it's had such a resurgence here on BookTube is because in 2022 is when the new edition came out. So I think that's why it started making the rounds. This is a science fiction / dystopian novel where we are following 39 women and one girl being held prisoner in a cage underground. They have no idea why they are being held there. They don't remember how they got there. They are being guarded by men. The male guards do not speak to them. They do not look at them. The women are not permitted to touch each other or argue with each other. The women have memories of their lives before the cage and memories of their families and experiences before they found themselves in this cage. But the little girl there does not. She has no memories of the times before and only knows her time in the cage. One day, there is a loud siren. The guards run out. The women escape and then find themselves in a barren world with no people in it. This is told in the first person perspective of the little girl. She has no name, and that is all I can tell you. It is honestly best to go in blind. I personally do not like dystopian or sci-fi, and the only reason I picked this up was because I was doing a reading challenge where the prompt was to read a well-reviewed book in a genre that you didn't like. And since I don't like dystopian, and since this has been reviewed everywhere and everyone loved it, I picked it up. And I absolutely loved it. Loved it. And this, to me, isn't so much dystopian as it is about human philosophy. It's, nature versus nurture. And my mind was so blown by this book, and I cannot stop thinking about it. I had so many emotions when I read it. I found myself crying hysterically at a red light while I was doing errands one day while I was thinking about the book because I couldn't get the book out of my head. It was just so amazing. And I actually want to tell you all the things about it. I want to tell you everything about this book, but then I'm afraid you won't go and read it. So I'm not giving you any more of the plot or what I discovered in here, because I just think going in blind is really going to enhance the experience. And now I know why all of the booktubers reviews that I read about this book also did not go into detail, because I thought it was weird. They all said the same thing, like it's 39 women and a girl in a cage, and one day they escape. I'm like, okay. Now I know. So highly recommend. Loved this book. I want to read it again. So I think I'm going to have to read it again so I can just do some more highlighting and annotating. I just read it through. I didn't do any annotating. So yeah, highly recommend. Go in blind. Read this book. So that's it. 3 books that I've read. Have you read any of these? Let me know what you think about them, especially if you've read The Bell Jar. I'm curious to know what if you've had a different experience with The Bell Jar. What am I missing? Why am I not feeling it to be profound as other people have? Let me know. I would really like your thoughts. And if you have read I Have Never Known Men, no spoilers in the comments. I want people to go in blind, but let me know if you've read it and you've loved it. So yeah, thank you so much for joining, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.